Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Hello. You don't need to check the front pages to know that we live in a fractured and splintered world, from the struggling Europeans to the bloodied Arab autumn, from the American empire pacing backwards and the United Nations more babble than world government. Today, we're going to look at the special European origins, the perils, and perhaps the future of internationalism. Is supranationalism, being ruled from above the level of the nation-state, possible? Is it inherently undemocratic? These are questions all countries are wrestling with. Mark Mazower is the author of a new book, Governing the World, The History of an Idea. But we're also going to be looking particularly closely at supranationalism in Europe and from the less familiar Eastern aspect. Victor Sebestyen is a Budapest-born British journalist who wrote a book about the fall of communism. Helen Samueli writes and blogs about Russia, Eastern Europe and the EU, and is co-founder of the EU Referendum blog. And we're going to kick off by looking at a frankly sinister version of internationalism, the one imposed by the Red Army on Eastern Europe after 1945. Anne Applebaum is the author of Iron Curtain, The Crushing of Eastern Europe. And the first part of this book is a pretty straightforward tale of slaughter, repression, mass forced migration, the destruction of what remained of European elites, I suppose, in these countries.
Yes, that's an optimistic and cheerful way to put it. But no, the first part of the book is about the specific measures the Red Army took when they arrived in Eastern Europe. And they happened at slightly different times in different countries, but they were really all the same. And one of them was the creation of the secret police, which they did often before they got there. Another was the taking over the radio, which they considered by far the most important form of media because it reached the masses, as they believed. They were great believers in propaganda and in their own propaganda. And another one, as you say, was the very specifically targeting of civil society, by which I mean everything from church groups and women's groups to chess clubs and hiking clubs. And those were all done very systematically in every country, even often before they engaged in any political change or in any manipulation of elections.
And the new rulers were, by and large, imported from Moscow. They were Moscow communists very often, at any rate.
Well, they were domestic communists. They were Poles or they were Hungarians or they were Germans, but many of them had spent the war in Moscow and had been heavily indoctrinated in the Soviet Union.
And in each of these countries, which are very, very different histories, about something quite similar was done. The attempt to impose a uniform regime behind the sort of decoration of national difference.
Yes, the idea was that each of these countries would become a totalitarian country, by which I mean a country where every conceivable independent institution is controlled one way or the other by the state. So, as I say, everything from your workplace to your hospital to your chess club was controlled.
We know a lot about the economic failure of Eastern Europe and the collapse there. But your book's very interesting on the kind of early stages of the failure of the idea as well. The attempt to create a new kind of human being, starting at kindergarten and working through school to produce a sort of uniform Soviet-style citizen who didn't have national characteristics. And in each of these countries, that comes apart remarkably quickly.
Remarkably quickly, actually. The one of the interesting things about the communist idea is that it failed immediately. It failed from the beginning, and it was constantly in crisis. And you read these wonderful reports of Politburo arguments, for example, in East Germany in the 40s. There's an argument where there's an argument because all of the private businesses in the country, where there's still some remaining then, are doing better than the state businesses. How can this possibly be true? How can they explain it? How can they stop it? And some of them say, well, we must close down these private businesses, and that will help the state ones. And then another person says, no, but then there will be no food distribution and people will starve. So there's an argument within the regime about the ideology all the way from the beginning to the end.
And in each country, there are struggles when sort of national culture and national heroes come to the fore. There's a very interesting debate in Poland about Chopin, for instance.
Yes, and who owns Chopin? Is Chopin a communist, proto-communist figure who can be trumpeted as some kind of internationalist, or is he a Polish national hero? And how to portray him and how to show him.
And same with Goethe in East
Goethe's
Germany.
the communists reinvent Goethe as a proto-internationalist. This is a man who was a bourgeois, wealthy, and so on. They say, well, he was a figure of his time, but had he lived now, he would also be a communist. And they go back and reinvent national history and reinvent national legends.
And this attempt to impose a sort of supranationalism on this part of Europe, going beyond the Red Army and the Secret Service, seems to me to have its kind of ghastly, but also its comic moments as well. It's a wonderful account of an attempt to kind of mimic the Tour de France bicycle race.
Yes.
Unite all Soviet citizens in Eastern Europe together, and it doesn't go very well.
No, the idea is that they'll have an internationalist race, which is different from the national races in the West. And what happens is that I think it's the Czechs become very, very nationalist during the race, and they start cursing the Poles as they're cycling by. And that's wrong. That's not supposed to happen. And so they require all kinds of explanations. This was the peace race, I believe it was called.
And so after what you call the heroic period of Stalinism, or heroic Stalinism, when there's all these Stalinist cities being created and Stalin's giving Warsaw his wonderful monumental architecture and so on, quite quickly there are cultural rebellions before the real rebellions. There are youth rebellions. Just tell us a little bit about how people kick back so quickly.
Well, totalitarianism contains the seeds of its own destruction. When you try to control everything, that means that everything is a form of rebellion. So if you try to control all the artists and you want them all to paint like social realists, and one of them says, no, I'm going to paint an abstract painting, then he's a political dissident. The same goes for youth groups. You want to control all the youth groups. Then somebody says, no, I'd like to form an independent scouting troop because we'd like to climb mountains instead of going hiking on the flat land.
Yes.
He's a political dissident.
Yes.
And the most famous one, if you have a workers' strike, it's not just a workers' strike because they want more pay. It immediately becomes a big political issue. And you begin to see that immediately. I mean, immediately, as they try to control everything becomes a form of pushback. And the cracks open quite quickly. So even at the height of Stalinism, you begin to have young people dressing sort of as if a little bit like beatniks in the West. It's hard to describe what they wear as anything we would understand as a fashion, but they understood it as a fashion.
Yeah, what I find fascinating about this is that we were taught in this country of a sort of period of frozen sort of immobility in Eastern Europe, and what this shows is a cascade of constant change and crisis and challenge happening all the time.
Yeah, the regime was constantly in crisis, and it was constantly trying to fix what it saw as problems that shouldn't even be taking place. Why are these young people wearing red socks? That's not in the rule book. They're defying us. They're not supposed to do that. We must have educated them wrong. We need more ideology and more propaganda.
Yeah. Victor Sebastian, you wrote Revolution 1989 on the fall of how this story all ended. How fascinated are you by the earlier stages? Because as I say, I mean, you're from Budapest originally yourself, but I knew relatively little about this story.
Well, I was actually just a baby when I left Budapest, so I don't remember.
So you don't remember it very clearly, okay.
I don't remember it at all, but I worked on a book about the 1956 Hungarian Revolution, so I did quite a lot of work on the early years, and yeah, it contained pretty much the same sort of arguments were going on in the Politburo in Hungary in the 40s. And it seemed obvious that they were given any freedom at all, any little inkling of liberalism, and it would open the floodgates, which is exactly what happened in the 50s.
Helen Samueli, you also, I mean, you were a school child during some of this period.
I spent my childhood there, but I'd like to sort of remind people of the great Hungarian football team, which was
it's in my book.
Thank you. And for our sponsor. I'm actually slightly too young to remember them at their height, but I do remember the stories about them. And I think they were all officers of the army, so that it could be an amateur football team. And some of them were also deputies of parliament. Puskás was a deputy in the parliament. And the interesting thing about the football team is that it was the one thing that you could support and be nationalistic about. So when in 1954 they lost in the World Cup to West Germany, it was a kind of an unnational tragedy. And it really was a national tragedy, and there was a kind of a demonstration. And when the football team arrived back, they had to be smuggled off the plane because people were afraid. But there was a wonderful story about Puskás when the Hungarian team was allowed to win against anyone. Well, I mean, you couldn't stop them, as the English team found out. But they were not allowed to win against the Soviet team. You just could not. I mean, there was just no possibility. Big Brother had to win. And there was a wonderful story about a Hungarian-Soviet match in which Puskás took the ball right across the field, all the way to the practically open Soviet goal. And then he stopped the ball and he grinned at the audience and shot it wide off the football gate.
It's kind of wonderful vignette.
And the audience, of course, understood exactly what was going on. And as Anne said, it was a rebellion. That was it. I'm just kind of doing two fingers to them.
So we're talking about one version, a failed recent version of imposing supranationalism, or as it was called, internationalism, on part of Europe. Mark Mazower, I want to turn to your book because you tell the whole story, as you said, of an idea. And internationalism is a word that doesn't appear until just shortly after the Napoleonic era. And the concert of Europe. We're not talking about the Red Army, but we're talking about the Russian army. Just paint us a picture of that first version of internationalism.
Yes, it's in the 1820s and the 1830s that people start using the word international at all, and they do so in the context of the order that's been imposed on Europe after Napoleon's defeat, an order that's imposed by 4 or 5 monarchs and emperors. Eastern Europe is one of the regions that is under the sway of these empires. The Polish question is one of the questions that awakens interest in the idea of another way of organizing the world. That is to say, a way in which the world would be organized by nations, banding together, ruling themselves, and then cooperating with one another. And that's the beginning of a long set of arguments that will eventually lead to things like the United Nations, the European Union.
So right at the beginning, this connection between nationalism and liberty is ingrained in the European story.
Nationalism and liberty, I think that's right. That's a connection that we're familiar with. Perhaps the connection we're less familiar with is the very tight connection the nationalists see with internationalism. In other words, the nationalists are internationalists. They believe that only through cooperation between Italians and Poles and Germans and Greeks will you have national liberty.
Your book tells the story of all sorts of associations and clubs and dreamers and ideologies which are involved in internationalism. But in terms of sort of practical getting together, it's things like the Red Cross, it's things like international lawyers making agreements before anybody else.
Doctors, engineers are very important in this story. So there's a kind of pre-20th century history of quite effective international cooperation. But of course the story that we're familiar with is the one that emerges once great powers take this up. And that's, in a way, the second half of the story that gets us to things like the United Nations. And a big conundrum there. Why do some great powers suddenly emerge and embrace internationalism? After all, most great powers had existed happily for centuries without the idea.
I suppose the most obvious example is the United States, where you have this interesting combination of Wilsonian idealism and pretty ruthless self-interest as it becomes clear that America is going to be a hegemony, at least across a third of the world.
Yes, I think one of the things that I realized, as I thought this through, was the 19th century had been the story of two competing ideas: a conservative idea of internationalism, great powers get together, and a radical idea, or rather a number of radical ideas of internationalism, whether you're a free trader or a communist. And what's so fascinating about the United States, once it enters the world stage, is that it incarnates both these positions simultaneously. It's going to be a great power, and therefore it's going to be internationalist, and it's going to be the radical great power that's going to remake diplomacy. And so we're not going to live in the world of Metternich and Talleyrand and all these horrible Europeans who did things behind closed doors.
And you get this extraordinary period in sort of 1945, 1946, where there is a kind of tumbling and acceleration of international institutions and idealism and founding charters and groups coming together at just the same time, of course, as in Anne's world, the Red Army is stamping on Eastern Europe.
Yes, and in fact, we have a very interesting memorandum from Zhdanov in 1947 in which he says, effectively, we the Soviets are supposed to be the internationalists. How come everybody else is banding together and creating international clubs and we're lagging behind? And he gets a little worried about this for a moment. Then they found the Cominform.
And was there a period, do you think, where the United Nations really was accepted by Washington as, you know, a new proto-world government, or was there always a deep ambiguity between the importance of what's called the American Empire and this talking shop on the Hudson?
I think the United Nations was accepted by Washington as an instrument twice. One in the middle of the war, 43-44, and the second in the Kennedy years. In the early 60s, when they really they believe that America is not perhaps so differently from what the Soviets believe under Khrushchev, that they have a model for every society in the world, and the UN is going to help them. And then it all goes horribly wrong because the General Assembly gets filled up with lots of post-colonial powers who turn out to hate the Americans, and Washington loses faith.
Meanwhile, you have a rival idea about supranationalism inside Europe, which is kind of mostly ignored by the Americans for a long time. It takes them a long time to quite understand what's going on, I think.
Well, there's a lot of American support for the idea of European integration, and Washington is pushing this very, very hard in the late 40s and the early 50s. So I'm not sure I agree with that. I think that they're happy to see France and Germany band together. The last thing they want is to have to come into Europe militarily again, and they also think it will help Western Europe against the Soviets. So there's American support, but you're right that the primary impetus for this is from European political elites who have a very vivid memory of the war, absolutely determined this will not happen again, and think that integration is the obstacle to that. The passing of that generation now, I think, is perhaps the greatest obstacle to any continuation of the European project.
Before we open this up, very straightforward, easy question for you to answer. What's the future for internationalism now, with the United States so ambiguous about the UN?
The gloss has come off it. That's probably good in some areas where international institutions did harm, and bad in other areas like global warming, where we're not going to be able to do anything at all unless we have international cooperation.
So this is both the history of an idea, but it's also a warning about what happens if this idea is now on its deathbed.
I'm a historian. I look back, but people may read that into.
Does anyone want to come in on that? Victor?
Well, there are still people who do believe in Europe as an idea, and whether the euro fails or euro doesn't fail. If you look back as historians, we look back actually at an extraordinary success over 75 years, 70 years in Europe, which has brought unprecedented prosperity and freedoms and democracy. And we tend to get caught up rather in EU directives about bent bananas or whatever. But actually, if we look back, we haven't seen anything like it since the Roman Empire.
And Applebaum.
I want to pick up on something you said. Why large nation states want to join these institutions. I can speak about one country, Poland, is a very interesting example of a country which wants to be in the EU and is now more supportive of the EU than it ever was because it sees the EU as a way to strengthen its independence and preserve its sovereignty. The Poles would rather be integrated economically and politically into Europe than be somehow lost in between Germany and Russia as they have been for the last 300 years. And the experience of being in the EU has been almost entirely positive, and the support for the EU is something like 80% in the country, despite the existence of Eurosceptic parties and Eurosceptic politicians there as everywhere else. So it's from that perspective, it looks very, very different from the perspective of a former great power like UK or France.
And Poland's key alliances these days seem to be more with Germany and Sweden than...
Poland has the best relationship with Germany that it's had in 300 years, or maybe 600 years, I don't know.
Which is undoubtedly a good thing. Mark?
I would agree with both points. The European project has been overwhelmingly positive, and I think that's absolutely right about why states want to be part of it. We are in a new phase, however, as a result of global financialization, because the imposition of the euro, as we can see in Greece, has created a situation where countries mismanage their finances. They find a degree of sovereignty taken away from them, perhaps temporarily, and perhaps through their own fault, that politically is extremely hard to manage. And so there are great dangers in this, and great dangers for Europe. And I say this as somebody who wants the European project to succeed.
Helen, as one of the co-founders of the EU Referendum blog, talk to us a little bit about your sort of philosophical attitude to supranationalism.
I think we're confusing internationalism with supranationalism. I think people do that sometimes by mistake and sometimes quite deliberately. I mean, internationalism is something, like the Red Cross. It's organizations, individuals coming together and organizing whatever they need, lawyers. So
essentially civic or professional.
That's right. This is the civic society. This is the thing that the Soviets hated so much in their own countries. You have trading arrangements, you have universities coming together, you have the Red Cross, you have this and that. Supranationalism is, of course, something quite different. And this is the problem. This is what people aren't happy about. The EU, let's not call it Europe. Let's call it what it is, the European Union. And what it is, it's a supranational organisation. It is actually the real government of all the countries. It legislates for us. And if you go through the treaties, you will see that our parliament that we elect, the House of Commons we elect, actually has no right to throw out the legislation that comes from Brussels, and a lot of it bypasses parliament. It legislates for all the countries, so it actually creates a completely different and unaccountable level of government. And that is what people object to, not to international cooperation between countries or trade between countries or the Red Cross or, university students going on exchanges. Nobody objects to that, or very few people anyway. But what I think that people do object to, and I think they object to that in most of the countries, even the East European ones, is that directives, and also I'm using directive in this wider sense because it's actually a bit more complicated than that, are imposed from outside, and the people we elect, and this is a particular problem for democratic countries, which actually most European countries are now, that we elect a government, we have a legal system of some kind, and it is simply overruled.
And the crunch point this time comes not with armies, but with money. I mean, that seems to be the thing that has really...
in fact, because the European Union doesn't have an army and doesn't have a real police force, no matter what anybody says, but it can, just move into a country and say, right, I'm afraid you really cannot run your affairs. And incidentally, some of us warned that this was going to happen with the euro, that the more fragile political structures will not be able to stand up to it.
Okay.
So...
Victor, you know, on this.
Well, one quick point is I would have thought globalisation is a form of internationalism, of not through institutions, but in reality. But coming back to Eastern Europe, which I'm not sure that you're right, that the majorities in Eastern Europe are still, despite what's happened in the last 4 years, very solidly behind
the majorities.
Europe. But and in '89, that's what Eastern Europe, which had been made other throughout 40 years of the Soviet Union, what they were wanting was to get back into to be in the heart of Europe, in the European tradition, and that is still a cultural and identity thing within Eastern Europe, a large part.
One of the interesting things about the EU, actually, is how it defies so many of these categorizations. I was just listening to you. I mean, yes, you're right. There is a distinction between internationalism and supranationalism, but the EU falls squarely in between those. You mentioned those directives that nobody, about Euro sausages and bananas.
Well, it's a bit more than that.
Well, the directives are written not by obscure bureaucrats in Brussels. They're agreed upon by the diplomats of every country, and British civil servants help write them. And if the British objected to them, they wouldn't happen. So that it's a more complicated process than what you've just described. It's also true that only a fraction of British legislation is actually EU legislation. I think it's 5% or 6%, something like that.
No, it isn't.
But the and the EU has some sources of popularity, and some pieces of it come from below, and some pieces of it, as you rightly described, come from above. That's why it's such an odd institution.
We may be falling into the trap of talking about Eastern Europe and Europe generally, and not focusing on the individual countries, because we've heard from Anne Applebaum that basically Poland is signed up and relatively speaking happy with the EU, but there's other parts, including of Eastern Europe, which are in a much more difficult position. Let's talk a little bit about Hungary, Victor, because this is, we tend to think of all Eastern European countries as being kind of more or less on the same track, more or less the same kind of places. Hungary is not.
Well, there are always differes between these countries, and they've only been considered as a bloc because of the
brief permafrost.
Because it that's where Soviet armies happened to get in May 1945. That's all Yalta agreements. But yes, there are some countries are doing much better than others. Indeed, some countries East European countries did much better than others, even within the Soviet the Soviet bloc. Hungary, one would have thought in 1989, it was often called the merriest barracks in the camp, and it looked on the surface as though it was doing pretty well. But it has probably had a succession of the worst governments of any of the East European countries over 20 years. None of them really have got to grips with the past, got to grips with debt, got to grips with spending, got to grips with any kind of social policy, and now it's worrying because it's got become probably the most autocratic state in the EU since Viktor Orban became the Prime Minister.
And in terms
it's passing all kinds of legislation which effectively breaks the EU, the Copenhagen rules in the EU, which are supposed to ensure democracy and freedom. But one shouldn't exaggerate it too much, and there is still. We're not going back to Eastern Europe.
Yes,
Orban on the door at 4 a.m. is still the milkman. Indeed, there are milkmen in
Orban
Budapest.
was democratically elected after all.
Exactly.
But nonetheless, looking at their at some of the new legislation when it comes to the press, when it comes to broadcasting, when it comes to political appointments and so on, I wonder whether if Hungary tried to join the EU now, it would be able to do so. Well, it wouldn't. It would break all the rules. Yeah. Whether the rest of Europe would have them, probably yes. But unfortunately, but it would still breaks the rules. I mean, some of these, the government has the power over the press that it didn't even have in the mid '80s. Yeah. And it appoints all the judges. We've heard about Europhile Eastern Europeans. Helen Zaweli, you are very interested in what Václav Klaus has been doing in the Czech Republic, as was saying in the Czech Republic, as a relatively rare senior Eurosceptic voice to come out of the East.
Yes, and a relatively rare free trader and general. Well, more or less, more than Orban, shall we say, and a relatively rare believer in the free economy. And he is relatively Eurosceptic. I mean, I think he does have a problem in that he can see that the Czech Republic is a small country, and the idea of sort of saying, well, yes, we can just go it alone is a difficult one. But he is very much against the euro. He was against the Lisbon Treaty. He's against the various other fiscal arrangements now. I have to say that whatever people say the opinion, I seem to recall that when there were the referendums to come into the European Union in Eastern Europe, the turnout was spectacularly low, especially in Hungary, where it was actually under 50%, and they fudged it, which is sort of typical of, I think, Hungarian politics. And I speak as half Hungarian myself, so I'm allowed to say anything I like. And
about Hungary.
Oh yes. Well, the other half is Russian, so I'm allowed to say anything.
Anything
like
about anybody?
Russia.
Okay, all right.
Yes, but we're not discussing Russia, who are not about to come into the EU anyway. And the fact is that, of course, these countries would be allowed. Just going back to the question of would Hungary be allowed now, when Romania and Bulgaria were coming in, the Commission itself said, absolutely not. They're not allowed. They mustn't come in because of X, Y, Z. Their economics, their politics, and so on. They came in all the same, and we've had problems ever since.
Mark, this is almost certainly the biggest sort of philosophical problem for supranationalism in the world. It is happening right in front of our eyes in Europe, isn't it?
Yes, I think the European Union took internationalism further than any other organisation was able to do. It has more powers evidently than the United Nations, more sweeping effect on life than the IMF or the World Bank. So that what we see in Europe is this experiment, an experiment that I think was willingly accepted by Europeans because of their history and the memories of their history. I just wanted to say something briefly about the notion of Eastern Europe and whether this is going. I mean, these are essentially cultural constructs. Nobody talked about Eastern Europe in the 19th century. In the 1960s, nobody talked about anything else. They started talking again about Eastern Europe after the Iraq War, I think, because there was this sense, the famous Rumsfeld phrase of a new Europe to counterbalance against the old. And there was some response to that in Eastern Europe, where I think people were naturally very glad to be taken seriously again and to be noticed. And now perhaps we see, indeed, Poland has a very, very different history from Hungary or from Romania, let alone from Albania. Is Greece part of Eastern Europe? Well, I think the real questions are not these questions, which are questions for cultural historians. They are the questions of democracy, of politics, and of geopolitics. But these countries will always find themselves between a robust German economy and a very large Russia. They will have to judge their destinies on the basis of these choices. And these questions will remain for them long after people are still talking about Eastern Europe, I think.
But there does seem to be a sort of cultural unity in a lot of the northern countries based around traditions of law and religion and governance and so on, a sort of herring Europe as opposed to a pasta Europe. And the way you just talk about Poland, I mean, the Poles think of themselves as part of a sort of northern European culture, which may be separate from the EU or institutions.
They do. It's partly in joking. They talk about themselves as Baltic Europe. They feel closer to the Scandinavians. And actually, there's an interesting point there in regard to something Helen said a couple of minutes ago. Who are the real free marketeers now in Europe? And you rightly point to Klaus. The Estonian government is extraordinarily pro-free market. The Polish government is pro-free market. At least the finance minister is. So the push to free up markets, a lot of it's coming from the east now rather than the west. Certainly more. It's certainly not coming from France. It's certainly not coming from Spain. So
the idea of France as a free marketeer is a sort of we're entering fantasy land here.
So any stereotypes we have about Eastern Europe and what it means and what it stands for, I think it's certainly time to abandon them. I also think on the point of Hungary, in some ways, is an example of what might happen if the European idea weakens. Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, is very deliberately distanced himself from the EU, and he now talks about China as perhaps a closer model for the kind of country he'd like to run. And he sees himself as somehow a part. He talks very frequently about the crisis of the West and the collapse of the West. And if we have a collapse of the EU, I think we could see more of his kind of politics.
Yes,
Helen?
much.
You're shaking your head at that, actually.
Well, I'm not absolutely certain. I mean, I think you also. I was actually thinking about when you have herring Europe and pasta Europe. In between, you've got Central Europe, which is sort of Middle Europa, and
Sausage Europe.
Goulash
Europe. Goulash. Well, goulash communism wasn't such a bad thing after all, compared to other communism.
It didn't work. It led to the biggest debts, even bigger than the ones we've got now.
Yeah, well, I mean, the debts they've got now grew out of the debts they had under goulash communism, of course. And of course, that's a sort of a completely separate idea of European identity from all the others. I mean, I think this is part of the problem of the European idea, if one can use that in quotation marks, is that there is actually no such thing. I mean, they pick out. I mean, what the European Union has done in its ideology, if one can call it that, it's not like the Soviet ideology. It hasn't really got a coherent set of ideologies like that. But what it has done is pick out the sort of the nicer bits of European history. The European idea is all about democracy, liberalism, free this, free that, free, and to which one can always put up a list of other things. The European idea is also about labour camps and anti-Semitism and so on and so forth. And so they have this notion of the European idea must save the Europeans from European history.
Mark?
Well, I do think that the Hungarian case illustrates very clearly just what might lie in store for Europe. It might lie in store for Europe if the European Union disintegrates, but actually it might lie in store for Europe anyway. That, to me, is an even more compelling worry, that actually the European Union has not done a great deal, neither has the Council of Europe, about the situation in Hungary. It's rather ambivalent about what to do when parties that you might describe as post-fascist or neo-fascist or authoritarian in this particular case emerge democratically. And so we see that democracy encompasses within itself the possibilities for some very nasty forms of politics as well as very nice ones.
Having this conversation, so I should say, in Manchester in the middle of the British Party political conference season, and it does strike me, I mean, if the story of Anne's book is an enormously rapid quantity of political change in Eastern Europe in one particular period, we're seeing a very fast rate of change in many European countries at the moment, including in Eastern European countries. And one of the great failures of the British political establishment, and I'm sure the same is true in France and probably Germany, is a lack of understanding, a lack of interest, a lack of attention to what is going on across the rest of the continent.
I totally agree with that. I think there are real dangers of places like Hungary, Romania, and places that we might think of as small countries, slightly far off countries of which you know little and care about even less. But if the EU doesn't stand up for the democratic values, it's hard to, and if its economy is fracturing and breaking up, it's hard to see what the point of it is, and that's going to be more of an argument. And the rise of ugly things we've seen before in Europe, people looking for simplistic solutions to very complicated questions. Rise of anti-Semitism is very worrying in Hungary.
Helen?
Yes, what's so interesting is that the EU has in fact set up an organisation many years ago to fight anti-Semitism and xenophobia, and every year they produce a report that shows it's on the rise. So one wonders what they're doing, what the organisation is doing. And the other part of it is, of course, the EU's action in, say, Italy and in Greece of simply imposing their own Prime Minister is not exactly conducive to respect for democracy. And in the same way, I mean, it's quite right, they are ambivalent about Hungary and so on, but the fact is they can't actually move in and dismiss a Prime Minister who was overwhelmingly elected in a free and fair election.
Because it's not insulting, it's simply factual to remind people that a lot of European democracies have not been democracies or secure democracies for very long or historically. You go back to the 1930s and look at all the dictators and authoritarian rulers around Europe, way beyond Germany, and then you look at the post-war story as well, countries like France, from Spain and Portugal.
Well, these are some of these countries that have very shallow democratic, and Hungary has never really been a democracy until 1989.
And I wonder, you were talking about the strong pro-European feeling in Poland, whether that could possibly be, a relatively short-term period of economic exhilaration and growth and, finding a secure place at last after so long in Central European politics, and that there too there will be a kickback. There will be
Of course, it's possible. It's also possible that if the euro disintegrates, and with the euro the EU disintegrates, then yes, there'll be an enormous amount of disillusion. It's also somewhat dependent on this very close relationship right now between Poland and Germany. If something happens to change that, then yes, the Poles could become less enamored of the European idea, or anyway of the European institutions.
And do you think that even now, having Russia so close gives a very different perspective on the EU?
Absolutely. I think all of the Central European countries, as we should probably call them, have very strong cultural, historical memory of being dominated by Russia and by the Soviet Union. And they all feel differently towards Europe because of that, in their different ways.
Mark?
I was coming back to what you said about the Labour Party conference and Britain. It seems to me a tragedy that nobody in Europe takes the British view on these matters seriously, because the British government has really marginalised itself from the discussion.
Well, by staying out of the euro, which is not necessarily looking like a bad decision just at the moment.
No, but the long-term future of Europe is about more than the euro, and Britain has a lot to offer in this respect.
Victor, we're coming towards the end of the programme, so I want to give everybody a last go.
Well, yes, I completely agree with that. And there is no discussion here about the broader purposes of Europe and where Europe must go. We tend to look far too much at the short-term economic argument.
Or about that possibly unsolvable conundrum and how you integrate real democracy, which seems to happen at a national level, with supranational authority. And that seems to be the thing that nobody has yet cracked.
But that's the argument that's going on now between Angela Merkel and François Hollande, and the fact that Britain has no voice at that table about what kind of policies you adopt is extraordinary to me.
Final thought from Helen.
Yes, well, that was David Cameron's superlative political acumen about the so-called veto, which meant just there wasn't a veto, there wasn't a treaty, but he put himself out. But I think that's a temporary issue. I mean, Cameron will come and go. But I think it's interesting that prime ministers do. I mean, they don't last forever. But it's interesting that even everybody around this table, apart from me, sort of believes in what they call the European idea, apparently. I'm sorry.
I have no views on anything.
This lot. But nevertheless, it all depends on the national attitudes of the individual countries. You know, if Poland's relationship with Germany changes, as Anne said, then perhaps their attitude to the European idea will change. So therefore, it's not the European idea, it's the particular thing. So in the end, the conundrum is that we need to go back to international agreements, because supranationalism is not democratic.
Final thought from Anne Applebaum.
Well, I'm American, so I don't have a dog in this fight. It does seem to me, though, that from the British point of view, it's in the British interest to make Europe as much in its image as it possibly can, and to some degree, they've been successful. The single market is a British idea, and if they could continue that, it might be good for everybody.
Well, we have come to the end of time in the kennel. Thank you to all my guests, to Helen Samweli, who writes the blog Your Freedom and Ours, Victor Sebastian, author of Revolution 1989, Anne Applebaum's The Iron Curtain, The Crushing of Eastern Europe, and Mark Mazower's Governing the World, The History of an Idea, are both out in all good bookshops now. Next week, a fond farewell to the pen, as we discuss the dying art of handwriting with Philip Hensher, Diana Athill and Wendy Cope. But for now, thank you and goodbye. Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Hello. You don't need to check the front pages to know that we live in a fractured and splintered world, from the struggling Europeans to the bloodied Arab autumn, from the American empire pacing backwards and the United Nations more babble than world government. Today, we're going to look at the special European origins, the perils, and perhaps the future of internationalism. Is supranationalism being ruled from above the level of the nation state possible? Is it inherently undemocratic? These are questions all countries are wrestling with. Mark Mazower is the author of a new book, Governing the World, The History of an Idea. But we're also going to be looking particularly closely at supranationalism in Europe and from the less familiar Eastern aspect. Victor Sebestyen is a Budapest-born British journalist who wrote a book about the fall of communism. Helen Samueli writes and blogs about Russia, Eastern Europe and the EU and is co-founder of the EU Referendum blog. And we're going to kick off by looking at a frankly sinister version of internationalism, the one imposed by the Red Army on Eastern Europe after 1945. Anne Applebaum is the author of Iron Curtain, The Crushing of Eastern Europe. And the first part of this book is a pretty straightforward tale of slaughter, repression, mass forced migration, the destruction of what remained of European elites, I suppose, in these countries.
Yes, that's an optimistic and cheerful way to put it. But no, the first part of the book is about the specific measures the Red Army took when they arrived in Eastern Europe. And they happened at slightly different times in different countries, but they were really all the same. And
national characteristics. And in each of these countries, that comes apart remarkably quickly.
Remarkably quickly, actually. One of the interesting things about the communist idea is that it failed immediately. It failed from the beginning, and it was constantly in crisis. And you read these wonderful reports of Politburo arguments, for example, in East Germany in the 40s. There's an argument where there's an argument because all of the private businesses in the country, where there's still some remaining then, are doing better than the state businesses. How can this possibly be true? How can they explain it? How can they stop it? And some of them say, well, we must close down these private businesses, and that will help the state ones. And then another person says, no, but then there will be no food distribution and people will starve. So there's an argument within the regime about the ideology all the way from the beginning to the end.
And in each country there are struggles when sort of national culture and national heroes come to the fore.
One of them was the creation of the secret police, which they did often before they got there. Another was the taking over the radio, which they considered by far the most important form of media because it reached the masses, as they believed. They were great believers in propaganda and in their own propaganda. And another one, as you say, was the very specifically targeting of civil society, by which I mean everything from church groups and women's groups to chess clubs and hiking clubs. And those were all done very systematically in every country, even often before they engaged in any political change or in any manipulation of elections.
And the new rulers were, by and large, imported from Moscow. They were Moscow communists very often, at any rate.
Well, they were domestic communists. They were Poles or they were Hungarians or they were Germans, but many of them had spent the war in Moscow and had been heavily indoctrinated in the Soviet Union.
And in each of these countries, which are very, very different histories, about something quite similar was done. The attempt to impose a uniform regime behind the sort of decoration of national difference.
Yes, the idea was that each of these countries would become a totalitarian country, by which I mean a country where every conceivable independent institution is controlled one way or the other by the state. So, as I say, everything from your workplace to your hospital to your chess club was controlled.
We know a lot about the economic failure of Eastern Europe and the collapse there. But your book's very interesting on the kind of early stages of the failure of the idea as well. The attempt to create a new kind of human being, starting at kindergarten and working through school to produce a sort of uniform Soviet-style citizen who didn't have